In today's video, I'm going to be replacing the front brake calipers and the brake hoses on the Z3. In an earlier video, which will be linked in the description, I replaced the front brake pads and discs on this car and identified that the front brake calipers were in a really sorry state. Now, they weren't seized at the time and the pistons did push back in, but since driving the car, the offside front is definitely seized. In fact, it was getting a bit hot and I could smell the brakes and I thought, that's not good. I don't want to destroy the new pads and discs. It's a beautiful sunny day out here. It's going to be a really hot day, so I'm covered in factor 30. Now, I'm well aware that the journey from porcelain skin to old leather handbag is well underway, but let's delay it for as long as possible. In terms of parts, we have two ATE calipers. ATE were the original fit on these cars. The ones on there are ATE and they've lasted quite well. You can see here, it's even got BMW on it. But they want the old unit back, so I'm guessing they reuse the case. So two of these. And both front brake hoses. These are Hella, which also says Pagid, so they're obviously somehow linked now. Maybe they always were. This is the clip that secures it at the top where the brake hose joins the actual metal brake line. And I decided to order both these pins as well. Additionally, I have some special silicone grease for lubricating these where they pass through the rubber guides. Now, because these calipers and the caliper carriers, and unfortunately many of the associated components around, have all been painted red, I am going to have to do some additional work because I can't have nice shiny new silver calipers with old painted red caliper carriers. So I'll be stripping the red off the caliper carriers and I'll be painting those with some VHT silver paint. This paint right here. And to speed up the process of stripping the paint off these caliper carriers, I've bought these wire brushes to go in my drill. It's jacked up and made safe with an axle stand. It seems that when these calipers were painted red, everything got a bit of paint, including this clip, something I would have removed before painting, even this bleed nipple here, and both of these sleeves. Not the best look. .7mm Allen key. And remove these two 16mm bolts as we did when we changed the pads and discs. Then I can get this caliper carrier off and get it painted. The red Loctite that I used last time is certainly doing its job. So with the caliper carrier off and this clip off, I'm now going to just try and strip the red paint off these. I'm doing this first so I can then get this painted and then it will be dried by the time I put the rest of it back together. The caliper carrier is prepared. There's no more red paint. Now, before anyone gets too critical about the level of preparation of some of this, the sole purpose of this exercise is not to necessarily have a beautiful silver caliper carrier, but just to rid it of the red paint, which I don't want. I've successfully achieved that. The silver paint is really just to freshen it up. After all, even a new caliper doesn't stay looking new for that long. Doesn't take long before it starts to discolour. In terms of the bits that are visible, I'm going to give these a coating of this VHT silver paint. Caliper carrier has now been painted and that can be left to dry while I get on with the job. Using a screwdriver, I have very gently levered against this pad wear sensor. So it can be removed. Mustn't forget the spring. And remove the inner pad. I'm not entirely surprised that these cheap Ridex or Ridex discs have corroded so quickly on this surface here. Some of the better brands come with a coating here, like this little bit's painted, just to protect it from this, because it makes them look scruffy really quickly. Now, it is inevitable, it does happen, but I think I'm going to paint that little bit with some of that VHT paint just to give it a fighting chance and to scrape off any loose corrosion. It is only surface at this point, but it won't take long for that to really get into the steel. I've seen cheap brake discs literally rust badly in the space of a year. Now I certainly don't want too much of this paint to go onto the actual surface that the brake pads make contact with. Some will be inevitable, but obviously it will be dry by the time I reassemble this, and I'm sure if there is a little bit on here, the pads will just wear that off very quickly. That is much nicer. This is just like a powder, it rubs off very easily. I've checked that the brake hose is correct, and it is, so I can now clamp that off there. I'm just going to cut this brake hose. We can get this old caliper out of the way. Need to clean up this area here around this brake pipe. I've got the new spring clip, but I need to make sure that we give this the best chance of coming undone by cleaning it and maybe using a wire brush up there as well. I think some grease has previously been applied to these brake pipes, probably to increase their life. That is better. The paint on the caliper carrier has dried, some copper slip has been applied, some Loctite to the bolts. And these can be retightened. And I'm tightening these to 110 Newton meters. As I always say, do your own research, make sure you're happy with the torque settings that you use. Here we have the new brake caliper. I'm refitting this brake pad to it. And refit the outer pad. Just applying some of this special silicone grease to the sliders, and then this can be fitted into the caliper. Tighten these. As I've said before, we don't need to go mad with these. Refit the caps. Time to refit this little sensor. I transferred the spring back to it, and it just slots in like that. We route it through this bleed screw here. There's this little enclosure for it, but we'll be removing this again in a minute because we'll be bleeding these brakes anyway. Refit the spring clip. These are very readily available. I'll probably just replace these, to be honest. There's probably no need to have painted those. Turning our attention to the brake hose, which I cut off, it passes through the suspension strut bracket with a rubber bung which secures it in place like a grommet. It's easier to see on the new one here. There. So we remove that, and the new hose fixes to the caliper. 14mm spanner size here, and it just screws in. Caliper comes with a little cap here to keep the muck out, and we just screw that in and tighten with the 14mm spanner. We then pass the grommet through the bracket. Let's get a bit of WD on that, and that's in place. Now, using a snap-on 11mm spanner that's designed specifically for brake pipe unions, we attempt to loosen this. Give it a good spray with some WD, and it comes free. It is at this point that brake fluid loss becomes inevitable. We can remove this little spring clip. I'm going to clean up this little area in here. That area is clean. You'll notice I kept this end of the brake pipe pointed downwards. It's really important we don't get any dirt into the system. We can position this new clip. There should only be one way for this to go because there are locating tabs on the actual hose. This union is tightened. This little clip here is missing on the other side, but there's a crack in this one. I managed to get these from the dealer. Part number right there. These just wind on to a threaded stud that protrudes from the shock absorber. And the wires pass through it. So apart from bleeding the brakes, that is it on this side. This hose is nicely tightened. This clip has been replaced. The sort of hub area of this disc has been painted. Got most of the excess off here. To be honest, it was just like powder anyway, so it just rubbed off. Any residue here will be off after a couple of brake applications. Done. And on this other side, that clip is missing altogether. So I'm going to cut this cable tie. Wire brush this rather corroded threaded piece, and then we can get this on here where it should be, and that's how it should be. Much better. It's a very similar picture on the other side. Everything came apart okay. This has been loosened and it came undone okay. There's a strange Jubilee clip under there for some reason. I don't know quite what that's about. It's clamped off to prevent any unnecessary fluid loss. It's in a part here painted as the other side, and here is the caliper carrier and also the clip. As I said earlier, I'm probably going to get some new clips because I'm not really happy with those. But the caliper carrier is baking in the sun. Caliper carrier back on, ready for the new caliper on this side. And the driver's side, offside, is all back together. I figured you didn't need to see the whole process twice, as the only difference from one side to the other is that the passenger side has the wear sensor. Everything went to plan, everything's good there. I don't know what in the name of all that's holy was going on here. We've got some sort of Jubilee clip. I think this was to compensate for the fact that this clip was totally flattened. I mean, why not do it properly? Replace that clip. I cannot bear bodges like this. It really grates, says he with a tennis ball holding his battery in place. But that's only temporary. While I was under here, I found this corrosion on the actual front subframe. I had a bit of a scrape at it. It's not bad, it's not gone right through or anything. So I've removed any loose material and I will just be spraying that with some wax oil for the time being until I work out what I'm going to do with it. To finish this job, I now need to bleed the brakes, and I'm going to go all the way around the car and bleed the brakes with a pressure bleeder. I'm going to bleed about ½ a litre through each brake caliper bleed nipple, providing they're not seized, because I don't know the status of the back ones at the moment. But we'll work our way around and see what we find. I use an Eezibleed pressure bleeder, and it runs off a spare wheel, so the spare wheel must have no more than 20 psi, and it just forces the brake fluid through under pressure from this reservoir into the vehicle's reservoir, and you can then just open each bleed nipple bleed screw in turn and it forces the fluid through. It's a very good system. I've used it for years. It looks a bit cheap and tacky, I know, but it's great when you're out on the move doing jobs. In dealerships you have a far more professional system, but it's nowhere near as portable as this. To start with, I like to draw out the fluid that's in the reservoir. And fill it with new. That way we're not waiting for all of this stagnant old brake fluid to come out through a bleed screw. So we get rid of that lot in there first, fill it with fresh, and it just gives it a head start. I use the Peller pump for this. I use .4 brake fluid. Some people get all imaginative and use much newer stuff, newer technology. This car doesn't need that. This is fine, and I've got lots of it. Whatever wheel and tyre you use, it must not have any more than 20 psi in it, or it will blow brake fluid everywhere. I'm just reducing the pressure on this. That'll do. With everything hooked up here, it's now a case of pressurising the system and then opening each bleed screw in turn. We are all set here for once it's pressurised. If that doesn't make you want to pee, I don't know what will. Now moving to the back of the car, this is actually the first time I've had one of the rear wheels off. These have a very small bleed screw on the rear. It's a much smaller one than the front in terms of spanner size. 7mm spanner size. Be a miracle if this comes undone. Probably just snap clean off, they normally do. Right, okay. I'm not going to force it because it doesn't want to know. No, not going to do it. To be honest, I'll probably end up putting rear calipers on it as well. It's quite impressive how this vehicle is bodily. I don't see any signs of any nasty corrosion or anything. All looks good. Can't say the same about the suspension components. They're all a bit scabby, but it's to be expected after all these years. So I bled half a litre through here as well, and that's all good. Have got the near side rear wheel off, and again we find a very sorry looking tiny little bleed screw, which is C-solid. Again, it will snap, I'm not going to bother. It'll likely be 2 rear calipers when I do rear pads and discs on this in the future. Brake fluid was a little too high, so I used my syringe just to draw a bit off, refit the cap and the connector, and we have a nice foam pedal. I've now just got to send these old units back. My God, they were so rusty. And as I say, one had seized the offside front. I know that had caused some binding. Got that in time. It's never a good idea to drive a car with binding brakes because you can warp the discs and just cause more damage, cook the pads, etc. Well, it's not often that I have to have a shower and a change of clothes before I record my outro to a video, but I was not camera ready at the end of that job. It was 30 degrees today and it was blazingly hot. I was a mess. But it's all done. Slightly disappointing that I wasn't able to bleed the entire braking system due to the rear brake caliper bleed nipples being seized. Yes, some might say I could have put more effort into freeing those off, I could have applied heat, etc. Yeah, I could, but it's too hot today, and I just thought, let's just not do it. I'm going to be changing those calipers at some stage anyway, so I'll be bleeding the whole system again then. There may even be some rear brake hoses to be replaced too. So I've just taken the car out for a really good drive, and it's beautiful. Roof down, no binding. I'm very pleased. Doesn't it just look beautiful? And the brake pads have worn away any paint residue from the discs, and they now look much more aesthetically pleasing than that nasty rustiness. So that's another job to strike off the list. Certainly getting there with this car, working through all the jobs. It really is a thing of beauty. I'm so pleased with it. So thank you very much for watching. Please do subscribe if you haven't already. And in terms of the next video, well, we'll just have to wait and see. I'm a little bit undecided as to what I'm going to do next. But one thing for sure, it's time to retreat to my very own private beer garden and enjoy this. I shall see you in another video very soon.